All right. So, hi everyone. Thank you for coming to our event, Organizing in a Time of Crisis. And one thing to note as people are trickling in is to sign in to our Google form so that we can get your contact information and talk to you about our campaigns, and so you can hear about all of our upcoming events. So let's begin with our Organizing in a Time of Crisis events. So first, I'll introduce the topic and then our speakers and talk a little bit about the format so you guys have a sense of when you can start asking questions. So the COVID pandemic continues to wreak havoc across the United States. States face drastic budget cuts in the wake of revenue shortfalls and increased demand for social services. Economic devastation, a hollowed out safety net, and unprecedented health and safety hazards on the job leave working families suffering. At the same time, the 2020 general election revealed widespread discontent with the old political order. Many working class people have lost faith in their institutions and are dropping out of politics altogether, which makes our task as a left even more daunting. How can the left navigate fracturing political alignments and organize around popular demands in a time of crisis? Our discussion today will center around this new political terrain, organized labor's political initiatives under Biden, and a case study in a popular Democratic Socialist response to the crisis with NYC DSA's Tax the Rich campaign. So I'll introduce our speakers. Matt Karp is an associate professor of history at Princeton University. His research focuses on the US Civil War era and its relationship to the 19th century. In addition to his academic writing, he's been a frequent contributor to left publications, including Jacobin Magazine, Catalyst Journal, and The Nation. His popular work examines the class dynamics of American party politics. Paul Prescod is a high school social studies teacher in Philadelphia's public schools. He's a proud member of the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers and Philly DSA's Labor Commission. On top of all of his organizing work, Paul also manages to co-host the Jacobin Show on Jacobin's YouTube channel and write for socialist outlets, including Jacobin, Labor Notes, and he's even penned some op-eds in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Finally, we're lucky to be joined by two organizers tonight from New York City DSA's Tax the Rich campaign. We have Fanon Laka, is a socialist activist and DSA member in Brooklyn, New York. She currently serves on the steering committee of New York City DSA and was previously campaign manager for Jabari Brisport. And then we have Jenny Zhang, who's an organizer with NYC DSA's Debt and Finance Working Group and a former housing policy analyst for NYC. Jenny is now working for socialist elected New York Assembly member, Marcella Matenas as her chief of staff. And Jenny will join us for the Q&A discussion. Matt, Paul, and Fanon will each speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. I'll offer some questions to start us off, and then we'll open up the questions to the audience. And so please enter your questions as the panelists are speaking in the chat, and I'll be sure to note them down to ask them. So with all of that, I'll hand it over to Matt.
Thanks, Briana. Thanks for organizing this session. And thanks for inviting me, even though, as I was saying beforehand, before we began recording, I do have to question my own credentials as an organizer. I did do some work for Jabari, both in 2017 and recently. I've done canvassing and so on, but I've done made a lot of phone calls for Bernie. But this is not my not my place of expertise. So I'm looking forward to hearing what Paul and Fanon have to say. But I guess what I could do is maybe give a big picture take on 2020 and what it means for class politics, especially the general election. I mean, I just wrote a piece for Jacobin that came out. I think it was on Paywall just last week. Maybe some of you have seen it, but I certainly don't assume that. So I'm going to hit some of the themes from that piece. And what I feel like the national political picture is. And I know that, actually, as it happens, our work right now may not be primarily national. We'll see what Paul and Fanon have to say. but maybe this will be a helpful just sort of framing for the actual organizing stuff that we're going to hear about later, and I'm excited to listen to. So looking at 2020, I mean, this election, obviously for the left, the general election, comes on the heels of, in some ways, a sort of both our most successful mobilization in national, primary politics in a generation or more with the Bernie Sanders campaign, but also our most devastating and still just totally, gut punched defeat with Sanders's loss in 2016, and then again in 2020 under different circumstances, which I think both confirmed my line after kind of trying to make sense of Bernie after his 5-year war, as I called it, is that the left finally is strong enough to know how weak it is. That we've moved from the margins to the mainstream, but we're very far from controlling, obviously, or even exerting real power in national politics. I think that we saw that, and we saw both the sort of the strength and the elasticity of the mainstream Democratic Party in its ability to sort of control and fend off the Sanders insurgency, and not just with sort of manipulation of politicians and media, but also in its ability to appeal to actual Democratic primary voters. And that was fairly devastating to see what happened to Bernie on Super Tuesday. Yes, they set the table for him. They set the table for Joe Biden. Everybody else did. But about a year ago next week, we still thought maybe some of these voters, given a one-on-one contest between Sanders and Biden, would choose Franklin Roosevelt over Warren G. Harding, and they didn't. They chose a return to normalcy for a lot of reasons that a lot of people have written about. I think primarily due to fear about Donald Trump. So that leads me to sort of where I left the general election, which is what the climate we're in right now is. We've made huge strides as a left nationally in terms of recognizing the broad appeal of a universal, basically a universal public goods program, of major structural redistribution in the economy, things like Medicare for all, various, other, universal public programs from, at the national level that are even seeing some daylight at the state level, like the $15 minimum wage, obviously, which has been passed in New York. And whether it comes down to whether we're talking about child allowances or student debt or free college, the energy is obviously still sort of with the broad liberal left. But we've also obviously run into our limits. And the theme for me coming out of the 2020 general election was a major limit for us right now is this dilemma of partisanship. We saw in 2020, the highest turnout in a general election in the United States since in 100 years, since the progressive era, reaching back before the New Deal. Joe Biden won a higher turnout from eligible voters than Barack Obama, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, all of the great, kind of presidential ideological, mobilizers of an entire century. And I think it was primarily negative partisanship. It wasn't about Joe Biden or what he did or did not stand for. It was about, opposition to Donald Trump, which I recognize, of course, was, from my perspective, essential. And I supported that effort to stop Trump, tactically in some sense. Yet I think that the rise of this kind of both mass participation and intense partisanship have come along with another trend that's much more worrying to me nationally, and that's class de-alignment. Essentially, the Democratic Party, which for about 100 years had never been a workers' party, far from it. You guys all here probably know that, the many ways in which even at its height in the sort of New Deal era, it was very far from a workers' party like as exists in Europe, created at most only a sort of very patchwork welfare state. And then since then, in the last 40 years, has been almost in continual retreat from even those limited welfare achievements. Nevertheless, until for most of the 20th century, the overwhelming majority of the working class voted Democratic. And that began to fade in the 1970s, and it accelerated since the 1990s. It's really gone into overdrive in the last 10 years. And looking at absorbing the results of 2020, when for a number of reasons, a lot of them have to do with shifts in the GOP and so on, and the rise of Trumpist, sort of ethno-populism. But a lot of them have to do with the direction the Democratic Party has gone. And some of them, I think, even have to do with the direction that progressivism itself has gone in terms of focusing especially on highly educated and often comfortable and affluent upper middle class voters, professional class voters. And if you look at the map in 2020, you compare Biden's map to Obama's map, it's really staggering to the extent to which, looking back, Obama was a working class president, not in his administration, but in his campaign. Even in 2008 for sure, and even in 2012, he won far more working class voters of all races than Joe Biden did. And he lost far more professional class, affluent, managerial voters than Joe Biden did. So, whether it's in a state like Michigan, where, Obama did much better in Detroit and Flint than Joe Biden did, and much worse and also much better in deindustrializing places like Bay City or Macomb County, and much worse in affluent Detroit suburbs like Birmingham or Bloomfield Hills or prosperous Grand Rapids, place like that. I don't need to get too granular, but that's the picture repeated 1,000-fold all across the country. And to me, for the left, where does that leave us? I know I don't want to go on forever here, but how am I totally lost track of when I started talking, Briana. How long should I go? What do I have?
You can go as long as you want,
Okay.
but maybe 5 more minutes.
Okay, cool. Well, so I think this is obviously, so I'll just say 2 things. This is obviously a problem, I think, for, and the piece argued that this kind of class de-alignment, where large sections of the working class, more than really ever since the 19th century, are turning to the Republican Party, overwhelmingly, white working class voters, because, our society is obviously very racialized. We know this. But in 2020, we saw a huge swing of Latino, primarily working class Latino voters in places from, Lawrence, Massachusetts to, greater Miami to the Texas border, shifting towards Trump. We even saw some small shifts among African-American voters. I think that's less significant. But we saw relatively flat turnout from Black voters in comparison to the massive turnout increases everywhere else, particularly with sort of white middle class, upper middle class voters. So we have a Democratic Party who, even though it's on paper, and I don't think we should deny this, that the Democratic Party nationally on paper is to the left of where it was 10 years ago, on culture, certainly, on economics also. I don't think we can just say Joe Biden is a neoliberal austerity president in exactly the same way that Obama was, or let alone Bill Clinton. I think we have to reckon with, this is a different kind of, I don't want to call it budgetary liberalism or welfare liberalism. They're thinking about substantial increases to the welfare state. That said, there's very little interest in structural transformation. If we're all here at the Democratic Socialist, of America, we want to see an actually equal society. We don't want equal opportunity. We don't want just poor kids to have a little bit more money. We want everyone to have healthcare, education, housing, jobs, justice. We want actual equality, not just, this is what we can do now and, wait a little bit for something better, which may not arrive. And my worry is that even with the move out of austerity towards a kind of a modest but significant sort of welfare liberalism, really, maybe it's an opportunity for us, and I'll be interested to hear what Paul and Fernand think about this. But I think given the coalition that the Democrats are working with, there's a hard cap. There's a kind of ceiling on what's possible in terms of major redistribution that requires taxes, that requires a kind of a real clawback of financial and corporate power, that requires major investment in, above all, the labor movement, which, these guys will be able to talk about better than me. So I'll leave that to them. And I worry that this coalition that the Democrats have assembled is not really going to be able to deliver that. You've already seen Biden, why has he not given a speech about the organizing drive in Alabama? he's the most pro-union president in history, and he's going to do some good things in the budget. Give him credit. But he's not talking about this essential fight for the future of the working class, because the Democratic Party isn't a working class party in the same way that it was, even when it was a very incomplete working class party. So that's my issue with the Democrats, and where that leaves progressives, where that leaves electeds. Just a final minute note here. I think we're at a crossroads. Sanders is obviously, in some ways, he's still important. He's the Senate, budget chair. We all have the T-shirts. We have the memes. But he's in some ways also passed the baton for the future of the party, and that's happening for the future of the left, the electoral left. I think the energy there is with the squad, the expanded squad in Congress, I would say. And just neutrally, not that I'm rooting for Sanders to pass the baton, but I think that's just kind of acknowledged. And at the state level, where people like Jabari and Julia Salazar are picking up the mantle too. What I worry is for these electeds, this is what I would say, is that, from AOC on down, that the temptation will be to sort of lean forward into this Democratic partisanship because it wins votes in their deep blue districts. And people love it when AOC mixes it up with the Republicans. They love it. That's what drives her fundraising. That's what drives her clicks. And she should mix it up with the Republicans. I mean, that's actually a great skill of hers. But I worry that the temptation will be to sort of, for this left, this supposedly working class left that cares about structural transformation, not just a few more welfare programs. I worry that they will surrender class politics in favor of partisan politics, and then that means playing the game of enhancing this professional class coalition that can never deliver the goods that we want. So that's my kind of like big meta take and fear. I'm not 100% committed to it, but I'm prepared to be argued with about it. But that's what I worry about. And I think this challenge for the electeds and for us in thinking about electoral politics, which is the only thing I know about, is not organizing, is thinking about how to maintain that balance between acknowledging the reality of partisanship, that motivates a lot of voters that we'll need, and also maintaining a kind of a primary focus on class politics and on fighting this accelerating trend toward class de-alignment. Okay, sorry. Thank you for letting me run over a little bit there. I'm really interested in listening to what everyone else has to say.
That was great. Thank you, Matt. All right, we'll let Paul take it away.
All right. Thanks, Matt, for kicking that off. And I think a lot of what I have to say kind of is overlapping with what you said. So I'm going to try to give an overview of some of organized labor's key priorities under the Biden administration that seem to have some legs to them, and reflect on what the left's role can be in these efforts. And we should look at these as organizing opportunities and opportunities to build and deepen the kind of alliances we'll need to build a strong democratic socialist movement capable of winning reforms that can transform working people's lives, like Matt alluded to. I think many of us can agree that as it stands, the labor movement laws is still very much disconnected from, and in some cases mistrustful of, its flaw, and productive engagement and mutual support on concrete campaigns that the labor movement sees as a priority. And so perhaps the biggest priority right now is the Protect the Right to Organize Act, or the PRO Act. And so this effort is being spearheaded by the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades, but there's enthusiasm for this across the entire labor movement. And it includes many things that have been on labor's wish list for decades. And so I'm going to go through some of the highlights first. So the PRO Act makes it illegal for employers to use permanent replacements for striking workers, or to even threaten to do so. And this practice has been common from employers since Reagan used it to defeat the PATCO strike in 1981. The PRO Act chips away at some of the worst parts of the Taft-Hartley Act, which was an anti-labor law passed in 1947 that severely limited the power and range of activities unions were permitted to do. Repealing Taft-Hartley has been a priority for labor ever since it was written. So the PRO Act repeals the Taft-Hartley ban on secondary boycotts and pickets. And I'll give you an example of why this is important. Let's say I work at a paper company and I go on strike. The PRO Act would allow Matt, who's a Teamster, to refuse to deliver that paper to Staples or wherever else in solidarity with the workers at the paper plant. And that's a secondary boycott. And you can see how when you ban that, that limits the class-wide solidarity unions can engage in. So this law would also include intermittent strikes, slowdown strikes, and partial strikes as what is called protected concerted activity. So part of workers' free speech. And, if anything, the PRO Act is actually more beneficial to non-union workers. Its most important components deal with making it easier to organize the unorganized, which of course is the central task of the labor movement today. It levies serious fines and penalties for employers that illegally interfere with union drives, and would make it illegal for them to hold anti-union captive audience meetings with their employees. It also addresses the problem of getting a first contract after unionizing, because many times when you unionize, it takes forever to get a first contract, and you can decertify the union if you don't get that contract. So the PRO Act would require an employer to meet with the union within 10 days of the union certification. And it would also repeal all state level right to work laws. So essentially, if the PRO Act were passed in its entirety, it could really stimulate the revival of the labor movement. So let's get into the legislative nitty gritty. So labor has expected labor law reform from every Democratic president since Jimmy Carter and hasn't gotten it. So to pass during this session of Congress, the PRO Act would need 10 Republicans in the Senate to back it, or Senate Democrats would need to end the filibuster, which does not seem likely. And if I'm being honest, I haven't seen much indication from labor that there is going to be some kind of innovative or different approach to lobbying this time around. But union leaders say that they are trying to take a long haul approach to this, and we should be involved as DSA, as the left, whatever you want to call ourselves. We should be involved in organizing ourselves with this fight now. And here are some opportunities that can come from that. We can build ties with unions that we don't have connections with in our area and be seen as a true, serious ally. And I think this gets at building kind of that trust and respect that might be lacking. And, a good example is in Philadelphia. I'm proud of the fact that I think our chapter has close connections to labor, but one union we don't is the Painters and Allied Trade. So, if we can get involved with them in backing this fight, even if it's a losing fight in the short term, that is an alliance we want to build for the long term. If a union or a central labor council in your area is lacking a lobbying strategy for this, a DSA chapter could be an entity that's providing that strategy or helping them think through how to really pressure on this. It could build up capacities of a chapter, for bird dogging certain elected officials. And it could even set the stage for a labor-backed primary of an unsupportive Democrat or Republican. Just imagine, the Painters and Allied Trades at their convention recently, they said we're not backing a candidate who does not support the PRO Act. So what if, DSA is helping them fight for the PRO Act and a Democrat does not support it? That could set the stage for a primary where labor is supporting a Democratic Socialist challenging as a real labor candidate. And also, the Painters and Allied Trades, they've shown willingness to work with other social movement organizations such as the Sunrise Movement. So there is an opening, I think, from labor here to work with as many allies as possible. So I'll hit another, there's definitely not enough time to hit all of it, but another key plank or priority for the moment is infrastructure. And this is something I'm glad Matt kind of brought up, that we can't think of Biden necessarily in the same way as like essentially 100% austerity all the time. They are making a lot of noise about infrastructure, and there's talk of a plan worth over $2 trillion for investment in roads and bridges and a high-speed rail network and renewables and broadband. That's something that people see as seriously on the table right now. And, we should be aware that the administration is now choosing to frame this in partly chauvinistic ways as part of our competition with China. And we can expect that some unions will adopt that kind of rhetoric. But this doesn't change the fact that an infrastructure overhaul is badly needed, and we know this would create many quality jobs. And it also opens up space for getting concrete green energy infrastructure projects accomplished and held up as a model that, the Green New Deal is achievable. We actually have projects on the table that are creating jobs and that work. And one thing I'm interested to see here is the new labor secretary is Marty Walsh, who came from the building trades. I'm interested to see if he can help facilitate selling unions on these green infrastructure projects as someone that comes from the building trades. So I'm kind of interested to see how that plays out. We should also be looking at this in terms of an infrastructure program as part of addressing racial inequality in employment and within the building trades. And there's been a lot of talk, and there's a long history about discrimination in hiring in the building trades. And the problem is it's going to be hard to address that without an expansion of the pool of jobs and thus the pool of labor. If there are less and less jobs, white building trades members are not ever going to be convinced to support affirmative action hiring policies. And think about, how are they recruiting to these apprenticeship programs? They're recruiting from their social network. So they're recruiting their white cousin, their white friend to these programs. So that can only be changed by a massive expansion of infrastructure jobs. So once you expand that, and you can expand apprenticeship programs and more people coming into the trades, I think that will improve the representation of Black and brown workers in the building trades. And I think there's going to be a battle over what version of an infrastructure package we get, because the Chamber of Commerce is also right now supportive of infrastructure. So I think the question is it going to be a plan that is public-private partnerships, which is something that Trump was claiming to push for? Is it going to be something where the Chamber of Commerce is going to try to avoid project labor agreements with unions? I think that might be the battle over what this infrastructure bill looks like. So I'm going to now turn to pensions. Many unions are facing a very severe pensions crisis. A lot of employers are now facing bankruptcy and cannot contribute to these multi-employer pension funds. And as many employees have lost their jobs, there's been a sharp drop in interest rates, and they've hit their pension plans hard. And so the House Ways and Means Committee did approve the Butch-Lewis Emergency Pension Plan Relief Act of 2021. And what this would do is provide money to assist these plans with loans directly from the Treasury Department, which would not need to be repaid. So 100% of participants would get their earned pension benefits covered. And again, I think there is real expectation that there are real legs to this in Congress. And this is something that needs to be highlighted. It's something that a lot of unions are looking at right now. And I think Matt touched a little bit on austerity. So state and local governments are already bracing themselves for austerity. There's already talk about service cuts, layoffs, privatizations. And so public sector unions are going to be in for a big fight against austerity. And this is the perfect opportunity to build alliances with these unions and involve them in progressive revenue campaigns to tax the rich, which I know we're going to hear about soon. And I think that the scale of this crisis may give us an opportunity. For many of these unions, it's becoming impossible to deny the need for progressive revenue. They have to face the material reality. Either we get more revenue by raising taxes on the wealthiest individuals and corporations, or our unions and our jobs will be destroyed. And I'll tell a quick little anecdote that a friend of mine who works for CWA in New Jersey told me that I think highlights some of these shifting alliances. For years in Jersey, CWA was the one of the only unions supporting a millionaire's tax. And all of a sudden with this crisis, all these other unions have fallen in line because they've seen the writing on the wall. The crisis is so severe that if there's a massive wave of austerity, their unions are going to be destroyed. So unions did line up behind it, and the governor actually did sign a limited millionaire's tax. And I think that's a useful example to look at. This crisis might provide an opportunity for a shifting alliance. And I think it's also worth going back to what Matt said, is that, on the flip side, there's actually some hope that there will be a pretty big federal stimulus package to cities. I just heard that Philly might be expecting like $1.2 billion from the federal government, which again, kind of might not track with what we're generally thinking about Biden and austerity. So that's something to watch. And so my last section is what this means for like our broader question, our broader strategy. And I think one big question is, will this be 2009 all over again? Do we actually have the coalition necessary to win some of these things? And I think my answer is kind of yes and kind of no. And I think the difference between now and 2009 is in 2009, the left was virtually non-existent. And now there's a little bit more organizational heft on the left. And we have some elected officials in Congress and at the state level that are echoing our views, and social democratic ideas are generally becoming more popular. But we all know that Biden loves nothing more than to reach across the aisle to compromise in a way that screws over labor and the left. So all of this, of course, is still going to be an uphill fight. But again, we should not think about these fights solely in terms of whether we can win them in the next year or two, but in terms of what opportunities for organizing it opens up. So there's an opportunity to build alliances and institutional connections with unions to build that coalition that maybe can be successful in 5 years, if not now. You know, like I said, labor by and large is still mistrustful and skeptical of the left. And these issues are fights that are an opportunity to build that bridge. And, you know, also in the process, build potential electoral coalitions down the road. But we do need victory soon. And I think labor needs some momentum and some confidence. And the population in general needs revived faith that the government can do something good for them. And that's why some of these things, even if it's a limited infrastructure bill, are still important. Think about also we get pension relief and an infrastructure bill, or even more than that. And that's all great and necessary, but it's also going to reinforce the ties that unions have to the Democratic Party. It reinforces the idea that we cannot do anything to risk letting the Republicans in power. And it continues to complicate our thinking as socialists of what we do about the Democratic Party. Because if Biden does come through on some things, it and the Republicans.
Darn, I think we're sadly losing Paul.
That was
public support for nurses.
Oh, you're back. Okay, Paul, we didn't hear the last thing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Where did I?
You kind of cut out and like.
Okay, I was going to end on.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna.
You were just talking about the Democratic Party and the left.
Paul, how about you type it in the chat and we'll move on to Fanon. Damn, we need universal broadband.
Absolutely. I'm really curious to hear how Paul thinks that the Biden administration complicates our view toward the Democratic Party. I think it's decisively complicated. Great. So yeah, hey all. So I'm Fanon. I'm here to talk to you about the Tax the Rich campaign, which will be like a kind of concrete case study on the response to austerity. I'm gonna like try to be nitty gritty. It's hard to not be boring when you're nitty gritty, but I will do my best. And I hope you all in our discussion we can like draw out some of the political questions from emerge from how we've approached organizing this campaign in New York. Yeah, cool. So, you know, when speaking to the organizers, I was basically told repeatedly that I should not tell you all why we should tax the rich, it being the case that this is a group of socialists. And frankly, even if it was like massively impractical economically to pass like large revenue measures, we'd probably even still see some compelling reasons to push for it. So, you know, for this talk, as with many, there's some good news and some bad news. The good news is that even if I wanted to, I probably couldn't entirely explain to you why we expect that a revenue package is very practical, that'll actually trigger economic growth. And so, you know, if you care about the economy as a whole, and that's the point of view you want to take, you know, that you should support this legislation. We do that a lot. I'm not one of the people who presents on that. We have Jenny here who can answer all of your detailed policy questions should you have them. But the bad news is that I am still going to tell you why we should tax the rich, alongside how our campaign in NYC DSA came together and what it looks like. So why tax the rich? I think above all, the answer to this is that it's programmatically necessary for the left. I think Paul pointed to this really clearly. You know, consider our political reality right now. DSA doesn't directly and on a daily basis collaborate with any of the left's congressional figures, and the strongest chapters of our socialist organization are electing, you know, municipal and state level candidates. I'm a big partisan of the latter. We can talk about that. But of course, the difference between national government and state or municipal is the ability to borrow, print money, or whatever it is they do to create the deficit and inflation, or you know, whatever Republicans are concerned about people spending money on. You know, there's money to be spent. State governments basically have to run balanced budgets, and consequently, any increase in expenditure has to be matched by an increase in revenue. Point blank. There's no subtlety there. The upshot is that for us to be able to win our major policy priorities, canceling back rent during the pandemic, single payer healthcare, a public power system, free CUNY, which is the city University of New York, let alone just ensuring that there aren't further cuts to Medicaid spending in hospitals or our transportation system, we need to be able to pass revenue generating measures. Of course, with decades of austerity at the state level, there's a lot to build on in New York. There's, like our taxes have basically stayed the same. I mean, I think one of the great successes of the Republican Party in the last century basically is the ability to block tax increasing measures. So our tax system, like our personal income taxes brackets were basically set at the beginning of the 20th century and haven't changed. So someone who's like making I think it's like $20,000 is paying the same in income tax as someone who makes like $100,000. And then there's like gradations like down below $20,000. It's completely absurd. So, there's a lot to build on. And also like a progressive taxation system could, importantly create the fiscal space for meaningful steps towards social democracy at the state level, which is important because, winning increased revenue means not only that, it's like we're going to be able to stave off the worst, it also means that it's possible for us to be able to make the argument within the state, on the inside, well, look, like there's a much greater degree of viability to canceling rent when, when the revenue is actually there. So it's a very different kind of question, a very different kind of argument. And it allows us to make that argument publicly on a very, very different terrain. So the question is like not only one of like policy viability, but also one about the conditions in which we organize both on the inside and the outside. So in New York City, we were all aware of these arguments for some time, and the people in our very cool debt and finance working group started to get involved in a statewide coalition to raise taxes on the budget for the fiscal year 2020 budget, so in 2019. Broadly dominated by NGOs or sometimes smaller unions, the taxes proposed were pretty meager. There were things like a pied-à-terre tax, which would have like taxed second homes. And rich people do have second homes in New York, but also like the kind of revenue you can generate off of that isn't particularly significant. So often that, to generalize, the strategy looked more like raising taxes, small taxes on the richest, rather than a massive shift in the tax system of the kind that we ended up developing down the line. Another problem is that many of these organizations proposed taxes that were tacked explicitly to appropriations. So the environmental people had bills earmarked for environmental stuff, same for healthcare, education, So, it's like totally a mess. All these organizations are like trying to do a million different things at once. There's no coherence, there's no overall campaign, nothing like that. A totally broken left, funded by, nonprofit NGO money that like basically, everyone's like trying to get their small win to continue their funding. It's not like a serious program for change. So, 2 years ago, we went along with this work and it just kind of failed. And I think we were more involved last year and it also like, didn't work. And so our team, over the last year was basically, and Jenny, who's here, when we'll be here for the Q&A, was like a big part of this, decided we were going to put together a new package that raises taxes on the richest 5% of incomes, taxes unearned wealth, taxes finance and business and financial transactions. And that set of bills I'll tell you about, but is like a pretty massive package. It would raise $50 to $75 billion a year. So it's not only like an immediate solution, but a kind of long-term solution for revenue generation. And of course, in conditions of economic growth, it would continue to generate even more money. But at the same time as this happened, we also, we NYC DSA also elected 5 new socialists to the state legislature, in addition to Julia Salazar, who we elected in 2018. Giving the socialists the strongest electoral presence of any group in the state, on the left, with the exception possibly of the Working Families Party, although who they own and to what extent they have meaningful relationships is like vague and unclear, and also sort of happy to talk about in more detail. But it was basically with this newfound power, plus the fact that the state was expected to run a massive $50 billion deficit with the potential of next to no federal aid coming from a US Senate with a Republican majority, we made the case to these other groups to sign on to our bills. And vitally, our strategy represented a big pivot in saying, well, what if we just got enough money to fund all of our priorities? And in that way, I think we were able to actually build a strong coalition that was like, these bills are about revenue, they're decoupled from any like particular expenditure will get this passed, we're all for redistributing wealth in order to be able to fund all of the different things that, you know, we're fighting for. And so especially with the urgent threat of austerity and the fact that even on the, like, there was a strong defensive incentive, you know, there's a kind of like, it was kind of a breakthrough, I think, politically for progressives, really, to be able to propose something that was actually ambitious and coherent. And so from that coalition effort, the Invest in Our New York Act was created, and it exists as a campaign that we participate in, although given that we're talking about NGOs without significant bases or mobilized membership, and as DSA, where we had just come off a series of electoral campaigns that running all across the city that massively built our base, we decided not only to just help the coalition, set up a coalition that, was adopting our legislation, but to try something new for issue campaigns. And that was run our own campaign that basically applied electoral tactics, that is basically massive voter contact in the field to the terrain of issue campaigns. So that's how we created the DSA Tax the Rich campaign, which has made nearly 250,000 calls to New Yorkers and hung a similar number of door hangers in key target districts all across the city. The idea that we've been using condenses a few key strengths that we have from campaigning together. We have, a strong inside-outside strategy where our electeds plus allied legislators are able to work together to communicate who is movable in the legislature and who it's worthwhile to move to us, while we build out a major volunteer leadership in even the city's most far-flung districts, building turnout in places we haven't organized before, and developing people from there really, really quickly and powerfully. Our phone bank operation uses Through Talk, which you may have used on an electoral campaign, but with a new feature we use to patch people we talk to through to the legislature while we're on the phone with them. Doing this, we've driven thousands of calls from constituents to their electeds where they demand legislators sponsor the 6 bills included in the Invest in Our New York Act. And what I think, just kind of from a subjective point of view, when you're on the phone with someone and you're walking them through how to leave a voicemail, how to make a political case for doing this, there's something meaningful about that interaction that's maybe a little bit different from are you down to vote for my candidate, whatever. And similarly, you can listen to the person leave the voicemail and sort of talk to them as they're doing it. And that itself is also, I think, really rewarding as a way to be organizing. So I think we've developed something, I think, a little deeper in people's ability to talk through something with people that you don't always get in given the constraints of the pandemic on the kinds of conversations and means by which we might be able to have them that exist. On the other side, we've used a door hanger operation to create a highly visible presence in these districts. We often target the area around a legislator's house, so that they're walking on the street and people tell them, hey, people are doing this, that they know that it's happening. But from our side, I think the really exciting thing is that we're developing leads and coordinators who are able to run trainings and move materials across the city in as many as 14 districts at once. Building up, I know I've said this 3 times, but just to lay out the stakes here, I'm talking about we recruit people sometimes out of our phone banks, sometimes deep out of our membership, who live in these areas, to set up the lead. And New York, is a massive city. It's a really wide terrain. So for us to be able to do that, to be able to identify and cultivate leaders across the city is an invaluable thing for our long-term project, not only being able to continuously pressure people, but ultimately to be able to identify candidates and run campaigns for primaries. And this model has basically proven really successful. Many relatively centrist politicians have felt the pressure of our organizing and have decided to co-sign this massively progressive revenue package. And I think that's really significant. It's not to say that we're going to win $50 billion in the next budget, but I think it's very likely that it is a meaningful negotiating position that's happening in the course of the budget process. And just to say a few words on that, the New York's budget system is basically has a strong governor who writes the budget and then negotiates it with the leadership of the Senate and the Assembly. And so we've been pretty effective, especially in the Senate, at kind of getting pretty close to making it the position of the Senate. We'll see how it turns out in a couple of weeks when the Senate officially puts out its position in the One House budget. But just whatever, just the state of things is that we've made major steps, which is pretty much unheard of, prior to our ability to do this, or prior to this campaign. And in addition to these like 2 planks of our organizing, we're also running a couple of other things. We're running a program where we reach out to people who leave voicemails and who are leaving those voicemails, and we recruit them to go to meetings with their legislators, allowing us to bring new people in off the phones at a pretty significant scale, with sometimes as many as 60 people. These are like non-DSA members, people way outside of our orbit, but signed up to like go through talking points, develop their argument, and then go talk about it with their legislator. We've also developed relational organizing tactics to drive in more voicemails and emails to electeds, which I think is like really great when you have like many thousand members like we do in the chapter, and some people aren't necessarily movable all the way to like do real organizing work. At least they can like move their network. That could be really helpful. And finally, I think that this might be the coolest thing about the campaign, but we've used this as a capacity building project statewide. So I think like whatever, like we're electing socialists to the state legislature out of New York City. We're going to be able to continue to do so. We feel very confident about the strength of our electoral operation, but in no way do we have like the ability to really contend for a majority in the Senate or the Assembly, let alone like really make an impact on who the governor is. And as many of you might be hearing, like right now, like Governor Cuomo is horrible, is truly horrible. So, like we, in order for us to be able to accomplish anything, like really building at the state level, like really building out the rest of our state's organization is a vital step. And so to that extent, or to that end, we've used this as a capacity building project statewide. We like by setting up our phone banking and our fundraising and our door hanging and creating like guides and resources and training so many people to do it, we've been able to also do the same process with people across the state. And I think it's like really great to watch DSA chapters that sometimes struggle or sometimes inward facing, but really like adopt this like, outward facing political project that feels a part of this like broader thing that like has an arc of moving towards something and will accomplish at least some of its goals, if not the whole shebang. I think that is going to really change and is really changing these chapters. And I think will hopefully open up new political horizons for us, especially as we go into 2022 and start thinking statewide about where primaries might be possible. Yeah, so I mean, I like have some final notes here on like, where things are in the budget process, but I think I just said it to you. So I think that's all. I'm very excited to take up some of the questions that were raised by the other 2 speakers, but I'll leave it to the Q&A to frame those. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you all. That was super informative. And I feel like we've really hit kind of like all aspects of the left. We sort of have like the electoral sphere, labor, and then a kind of campaign that is trying to do all 3. So I guess I have specific questions for each speaker, and hopefully I can kind of tie what you've all said together. My first question is something that you didn't really talk about, Matt, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot. It's something you also mentioned in your piece about Dylan Riley's recent New Left Review piece that talks about how the parties represent different sectors of the ruling class. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on that, and if there's any benefit for the left that the ruling class is sort of fractured, or whether or not it's not really something that we can leverage for our campaign work.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, you could say the ruling class is fractured. You could say the ruling class is ambidextrous, and manages to, stay afloat in whichever, major party alignment is on top. In some ways, just thinking historically, like as I guess I inevitably do, that's not so different from even when the Democrats did win a large chunk of workers. There was always also a chunk, in the New Deal era, there were always segments of the sort of the business class and the sort of corporate power brokers who, were supportive of the New Deal and were supportive of the Democrats. I would say probably less so than now. and then broadly across US history, the ruling class has often been, I guess, if you will, divided between the two parties. Does that mean that it's fractured? I mean, I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that we could sort of, turn it against itself somehow. But I think right now, as Riley points out, it's like, you have certain sectors that are increasingly democratic, as in, primarily the entertainment, media, and technology sectors are nationally democratic, and sometimes even very progressive democratic, like Liz Warren style Democrats. And all the way up to the top, into the C-suite. And at the same time, you have, extractive and sort of fossil fuel based industry, along with like big retail that are the most sort of conservative and sort of, right wing industries in terms of the executive leadership. But a lot of the corporate, elite in the middle, that still leaves out finance, real estate, a lot of other kind of, consumer facing industries are, you look at what General Electric does, they donate to, both parties every electoral cycle, and that's going to be how it is. So what does that mean? I mean, that's not really news, I guess. I shouldn't present this as some sort of like, big revelation to us. I think it means that, we're a long way from, building a workers' party in this country. But I think as the other speakers talked about, I'm glad they agree about this. There is some, leeway in this short-term moment within the Democratic coalition to sort of get some wins. And I see why that's important, at the state level and at the national level, absolutely, to get that budget money that hopefully can be turned into, as Paul points out, into, can actually strengthen unions. It can strengthen, workers on the ground level if it filters down and is mobilized right. And then, as Fernand talks about at the state level, that this energy can be used to sort of pressure legislators and to sort of make sort of welfarist inroads. So yeah, I'm not against that strategy at all. I just think that we should bear in mind some of the structures, and that we can make some gains without really threatening capital. And it's a long struggle, but ultimately we're going to have to do that. And that's going to be a different kind of fight than the fights that they're talking about right now.
Yeah, definitely. By the way, if the other panelists want to jump in at any point during the questions, but I'll kind of move along onto the next question I had, which was for Paul. Paul, you talked a little bit about the kind of self-reinforcing cycle of union power in the Democratic Party. So if there are a lot of people in unions and they're making a lot of political donations to the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party is more accountable to unions because they're huge donors. Right now, lots of workers are losing their jobs and unions are kind of hemorrhaging members. And as you point out, the PRO Act is very unlikely to pass. So given that, I'm just sort of curious what other options you see in terms of organizing people as workers. Maybe it's trying to organize the unorganized, it's focusing fights at the state level. Like, you painted a pretty dismal picture, so I'm kind of curious where you see some optimism.
Yeah, that's fun. I thought it was slightly hopeful, but yeah, and I think for one, so like even if the PRO Act does not pass, that doesn't mean that opportunities for organizing unorganized will not still come about. I'm really interested to see what happens in Alabama. There's been a lot of talk about these polls showing unions are more popular than they've been in a long time, which is true. Of course, that doesn't automatically translate into organizing new members, but just because the PRO Act doesn't pass does not mean these opportunities won't keep coming up. And I think what I was going to say, actually, when I got cut off was, I think an opportunity here is, 2020 was like the year of the essential worker. And there was this new kind of public sentiment, public support, and appreciation for, mostly blue collar workers that there wasn't before. And I think that can really be leveraged both for currently unionized members in upcoming contract fights, but also, think about like grocery store workers or Amazon workers or, delivery drivers, and I think there's a chance to mobilize public sentiment to support them unionizing, because I think many workers are now like, we really deserve a lot more. Like, we sacrificed during this country. We put the country, over the edge during this crisis. So I think we can, mobilize around that, and even think about, last summer, postal workers were like the national heroes, which I never thought my prediction would come true. But now, in September, the Postal Workers Union contract expires. And I think there is a great opportunity to mobilize the public of like, remember our heroes, like this is now the time to rally around them. So that's one thing. And I think, I think the anti-austerity stuff is perfect for mobilizing workers as workers. And I think it's something Matt writes about a lot, is that the unfortunate thing right now is everything is polarized around culture and urban versus rural and partisan divides. But anti-austerity can cut across that. And I'm really attracted to the idea, and like they've done pretty well in Seattle, is like you identify a local corporate villain, Amazon in Philly, it's Comcast, and you can really mobilize just sentiment against them. And now you're polarizing thing how we want to on class lines. So I think that's going to be important. I also think ballot initiatives are interesting. I don't want to say it's like a silver bullet. Some states and cities, the laws make it not really able to do it. But I think one story that's not talked about a lot from this election, people talk about the $15 minimum wage, but in Arizona and Illinois, they successfully passed tax the rich ballot measures. And depending on how you look at that, they were fairly modest, but it was significant. And I think what's attractive to me is that instead of voting for someone that has a D or R next to their name, it's a very down vote. Tax the rich, yes or no. And again, it's polarizing the way we want to. You don't have to think about Republican, Democrat. You think about who is the enemy, what are we going to do about it? That I see potential there for cutting across the rural areas. So I guess I would say austerity, ballot initiatives where possible, and I think there still should be opportunities for, mobilizing around the sentiment of essential workers in the future.
Hear, hear.
Yeah. I know Fanon had a kind of direct response to Matt, so feel free to jump in.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I just had a few things to say. I mean, one is just say, to underline, like, I think Matt's exactly right to say that there's a structural level that we're not reaching even with this campaign that makes it like a really dire question for capital. In fact, like I said, like there are arguments that this is actually, passing massive revenue actually could be beneficial even for corporations, even though they'd be paying higher taxes, just because it would generate increased growth through direct investment in the state. But I mean, one of the things that really changed the campaign was like we had this context where it looked like we were just going to be filling a budget hole, and that's not the case anymore. It's actually, it looks pretty clear that there'll be a deficit, but it's maybe only $3 billion, which in New York money is like not a crazy amount, and it's very likely that if revenue gets passed, it will easily fill that. And the question is like really about upside, which is good for us in the sense that it allows us to be programmatic about what's possible. But it's also just this like, it's this shift in maybe like what will be possible in next year's budget fight or whatever, in terms of how urgent or dire other forces find it. So there's this way in which like the Democrats being up allows us to be more confidently left, more confidently talking about what our alternative vision is in a way that I think just wouldn't exist when the Republicans are there. I continue to think we don't have a coherent strategy for the Republican Party. Thankfully, it's not such a question for me in New York. Like there's a Democratic supermajority in the Assembly and the Senate. That's not going to change really at this point. But it is for us nationally. And I think that we dodged a bullet a little bit having to think about this, but we have to continue to do so. The other thing I just kind of wanted to respond to Matt with was just to push back a little bit and saying like, I'm plenty sympathetic to the idea that like, politicians from deep blue districts who are able to like sort of combine a like culturally progressive affectation with like, a redistributive agenda, like might not be appealing to everyone. But it seems to me like, just looking at state politics, like the question isn't always one of like, who has the big platform, who's able to say something. Like, I think at times, like, it's worth just thinking about, like, how are we able to, like, effectively build organizing projects that are able to reach people? And it's sometimes a different kind of question than the question of how do you communicate yourself? Like, yes, of course, anti-austerity is something that can reach everybody. But the question then becomes, okay, how do you carry that out effectively? And I think, if you're able to build the base, and then, the question of, like, who you run and how they talk becomes pretty simple, because it's always going to be, for us, the Democratic Party consistently makes a mistake all across the country. They run, like schlubby, like, lawyers or whatever, who are able to raise money for themselves in working class districts, instead of running people who speak and sound and, are like the place that they come from. It's certainly a tenet for how we approach elections in New York City. And I think it's like something that is easily exportable. Like, if our goal is to recruit working class people into the socialist movement, then we're already identifying people who are viable candidates and who are going to, just by instinct, just by their experience, going to be able to overcome that kind of hurdle when it comes to their individual campaign process. And so the question becomes, like I said, how do you organize effectively? So, I just wanted to put that on the table for you all to think about, because I think it's important. It's like, an identity politics for the left, perhaps, but it's how people communicate and understand. It's, certainly, I think, deeper than that.
Yeah, I'll just say real quick, I don't disagree with that. I think it makes sense for candidates to represent their districts, absolutely. And I do think that there have been, I don't want to downplay the extent to which some of these, new electeds do actually represent their districts, not just, in kind of, brochure diversity terms, but in terms of, as sort of emerging from the working class. I just worry on the national scale. It's really about a national politics. And it's not so much about, like, culture. For me, it's not so much about culture versus economics, which is one way of framing it. I do agree with some of those critiques. It's about sort of partisanship versus class. And so that's kind of the point that I was making, that sometimes the national electeds basically get so deep into, like, hey, look, if I can basically pitch a fight with the most, like, hideous Republican, then all of the sort of normie libs will send me money. And it's true, it works. It works on both sides, frankly, too, because, Marjorie Taylor Greene is doing the same thing to Marie Newman that Marie Newman is doing to Marjorie Taylor Greene. It's just the same kind of, wrestling competition. But what I just think that, and whatever, play that game for what it's worth, raise that money. But I think, in terms of your actual strategic orientation, it's a mistake. Not necessarily to be like, oh, somebody from a culturally progressive district should absolutely be culturally progressive. It's just a question of where your relationship between your class politics and your partisan politics align. And if you're entirely doing, like, I'm the Democrat who's going to basically be the loudest and proudest and angriest at every reactionary troglodyte in Congress or whatever, and kind of just get involved in news cycle fights with troglodytes, then to me, that actually just deepens those alignments and hardens them in places where we need to make class politics inroads. That is, yes, in rural areas, in suburban areas, in exurban areas, and in places that are trending red, including places, Latino places. Like, we're not just talking about, the white working class. So anyway, that's my concern, is that kind of, like, adoption of, like, the team blue identity, almost more than whatever your issue positions are on some kind of cultural question, is the thing that I'm hesitant about.
I know Jenny wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say, so Matt, to your point before, you were saying that it's really important through all of this that we, keep our eyes on the fight against capital and kind of not be looped into just fighting with the libs and fighting with the Democrats just because they're, whatever, the Democratic Party. I think from our perspective, organizing the Tech Search campaign, it has been such a helpful campaign for highlighting this fight against capital and also highlighting organizing along class lines as opposed to purely partisan lines. And I say that because, so, like, from a policy perspective, what this campaign allowed to do was do a lot of political education about our system of capital and the alignment of incentives. So if you look at, like, the policy package, I'm not going to go into it. You can always find me after if you have questions. But there are, like, two specific proposals that really aim to teach the public about all the ways in which capital benefits from our current economic system and our current tax structures, right? We have a capital gains surcharge, we have a financial transactions tax. those are like straight up fights against capital, and we've been able to introduce them into the mainstream alongside our coalition partners and have that be part of the analysis that has been so critical, especially in a crisis environment like we're experiencing right now, where actually the rich are getting richer. We're in what's called a K-shaped recovery, right? You have less than half of the population, like 1% of the population, their income is going up, everyone else's is kind of going down, and we have this like divergence. So being able to develop actual policies that address that structural kind of trend has been such a core part of our campaign, our messaging, our policy, our education, everything. I think in terms of, we are always thinking about this question in New York now that we have 6 socialist electeds in power. It's about what's next. And we've realized that the kind of barrier against winning a lot of the things we want is this upstate, downstate divide. We have the city where there's liberals, progressives, people who are blue. Then we have upstate and Long Island, which is all red and like, whatever, there's little pockets of blue. So we have to be able to get over that as an organizing challenge kind of in the short to medium term. And in that sense, the Tax the Rich campaign has also been super helpful. It hasn't really borne fruit yet. Like we don't have Republicans signing onto this package. It's not there yet, but it's kind of doing the groundwork in terms of laying out the fiscal vision that socialists stand for along class lines. And what I mean by this, to get a little bit more specific, is that, so this is a state level campaign. And I saw a question in the chat about how, why did we choose state as opposed to municipal? That's very, very specific to New York. New York City's municipal powers, fiscal powers, are essentially all removed in the fiscal crisis of the 70s. So to enact fiscal change, which is what a lot of socialist policies require, we have to do it at the state level. But essentially, what happens is that the state kind of raises taxes and they raise revenue, bring it into the state coffers. A lot of that money actually then is passed on to localities to subsidize their education costs, their local healthcare costs, transit costs, whatever that might be. As a result of this crisis, what you're seeing is that in all counties, pretty much across the board, they have had to make cuts because the state is no longer compensating them how much they're used to. So even in like bright red districts, they are suffering from education cuts, local infrastructure cuts, all of these things. And the way they're having to respond is to raise property taxes, right? So like people get mad when you have to raise property taxes. We're kind of laying the foundation and trying to put Republicans on the defensive. Like you cannot be in this, you cannot hold this position. This is not a sustainable long-term position to just say, yes, I'm okay with cutting out public services, right? You still represent working class people. You still represent people whose kids go to public schools. So we are kind of doing that groundwork and hoping that eventually those things start to converge and people start to really look at it along class lines. So yeah, I think, it's a huge challenge, but I think for us, the Tax the Rich campaign has kind of been the perfect tool combined with this really, really unique political moment to put Republicans on the defensive and justify their policy positions. Obviously, things are not that easy. People are not logical. Republicans especially are not logical. It's not as if they're going to concede anything immediately, but kind of doing that prep kind of policy and stance work has been a big part of this campaign.
Hey, can I just say thank you so much for that, Jenny? And I just want to clarify, in case there's any ambiguity, I'm a huge fan of Tax the Rich, and precisely for the lines that you guys have laid out. And I think it jibes really well with what Paul was talking about anti-austerity. It's the flip side of anti-austerity. It's, revenue politics, if you will. But I think it does polarize where we want to polarize. So yeah, I agree completely.
Thank you, Jenny, for that. There were a couple of questions in the chat about how coalition partners were developed for the Tax the Rich campaign, and then in particular, like where unions have been in this role. And maybe that's where we can loop Paul in to sort of like, what are the conversations like in unions right now about, the impending austerity? So I'll start with the Tax the Rich folks, and then maybe Paul, you can.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit, and I think Jenny can say more, but look, the situation in New York is a little bit unique. We have, because of the governor's like outsized control over the way the budget is written, there's a built-in incentive for all unions always to run with the governor, and like I think along with that to be like very, very conservative about their picks in the legislature. Many unions in New York funded Republicans and Democrats. The UFT, a major example of this for a long time, and all of them basically have very strong ties to whatever local machines do. So they just always, in general, want to be able to make the most conservative choice, because ultimately it's just a question of like, what can they get from Cuomo, especially for the biggest unions like 1199 and UFT. That said, I think like, there are some more progressive unions in New York who are more sympathetic, but even the less sympathetic ones, we've made a decent degree of inroad in the sense that they feel, committed to the idea of taxing the rich in this cycle. And they also, in general, haven't taken public positions against our package. But the obstacles to really like actually getting them to like try to directly pick a fight with Cuomo are pretty high. And so consequently, we don't have that like wonderful opportunity that I imagine like you guys in Philly do, with like having like, in particular like reasonably sized unions that have like a meaningful base and that are like willing to pick a fight and go with the left on something. It's just very hard for us up here. So, we try, and Jenny and I were just on a strategy call an hour and a half ago, literally talking about this and how we can do some like quick lockdown. But, I think for the longer term, it's a major horizon for us. I think like we want to be able to show that we're able to really, really seriously, push things at a state level and start to build relationships on the basis of that. We see our electeds as a key element to use. I also, in my day job, work for Assemblymember Farrah Forrest. We're like meeting with the Transit Workers Union next week to talk about exactly these things. And like, the idea is like, well, maybe they're not going to take a call from DSA, but they will from our legislators. And so there's an important organizing, moment that's possible there. But I think Jenny may be able to say more.
No, yeah, I think you covered it, Fainan. I think it is still an ongoing challenge with the unions, mainly by virtue of just their proximity to the governor and like unwillingness to take a bold stance. It's also unique to kind of where we are in this campaign because there was such a massive reorientation this year, or really end of last year, that, the unions have taken certain positions. They are kind of taking the safe position, as in they're taking like the previous budget cycle's position, but they haven't come out and like publicly opposed our positions yet. So, there's an opening, and that's our challenge for the next literally like week and a half. But we've been able to bring some on board, especially the public sector unions. I would say for this campaign, like that's where things are the most aligned, and they came on board very, very early in the process. But with the rest, yeah, I think we're in a unique situation in New York for sure, and I'm curious to hear about what it's like in Philly.
Yeah, so I think I'll just say briefly, national level. I mean, it can be very spotty. Like the 1199 AFSCME local in New England, which is kind of like legendary as a left-wing local. Like they've been taking a lead on progressive revenue campaigns, but that's of course not the same everywhere. And I kind of highlighted the New Jersey example, which I thought was interesting. That again, these unions that historically were, similar dynamic to New York, were afraid to buck the Democrats. That's why they never supported it. They all of a sudden fall in line because it's a crisis. I couldn't tell you right now how much that's happening across the country, but I think that's an opportunity. And so, yeah, Philly, we're kind of at the baby stage of doing a progressive revenue campaign. But, and this is kind of where the movement within labor, the progressive movement within labor really reflects on this kind of campaign, because, where we've been able to get the easy support has been these unions where there's recently been a leadership change and there's been a progressive local or even just a newer leadership that is just more open and even maybe sometimes not even aware that they're entangling themselves politically by getting involved. But and that's kind of how these things feed into each other, where I'm sure, with Chicago Teachers Union leadership now that it changed since 2012, they're way more open to these campaigns than they would have been before. But yeah, I think like was said, the public sector, that's going to be who's hit the hardest, the most clearest by this. So I think it makes sense that there's who we should be targeting first. I think they're also more likely to get on board. And I'll just add this in here. I know some people will roll their eyes because I say this all the time, but it is worth saying that I really, truly view the fight against austerity as the most important racial justice fight going on, because, you can look at the numbers. It is very clear historically and presently, the public sector has been the greatest mitigator of Black poverty in the country throughout our history. And and Black and brown workers are disproportionately public sector workers, and these are jobs that are disproportionately unionized and with better pay, more stability, more benefits. So like, you know, if the public sector is destroyed, you're talking about a horrifying plunge in living standards for so many Black and brown communities. So I'm just gonna throw that out there. But I think this is why, you know, this tax the rich stuff, to me, everything aligns, because not only is it the right issue and it polarizes the right way, but, you know, it creates the alliance that we want to create. So I'll leave it at that.
That was great. Thank you, Paul.
My eyes are still rolling. Sorry.
Right.
Great point.
There were several questions in the chat about kind of this question of like federal versus municipal versus state. And I think Jenny started, you know, gesturing toward that, like the reasons why it makes way more sense to do like a tax the rich campaign that's statewide. But I mean, I guess like general reflections on, you know, where it's strategic to sort of place our bets in the next couple of years. And then, as Paul said, sort of like thinking about our time horizon as much longer than we typically do. You know, how does that factor into the question of state versus federal versus municipal? Anyone can jump in on that question. I think a lot of it was targeted toward Matt. But, you know, anyone can speak.
Sorry, I was just checking up. I was checking up on the questions in the chat, so I might have missed it. But if someone else wants to go ahead,
I can say a little bit about my thoughts about it. You know, I mean, look, most DSA chapters cannot raise $1 to $5 million for a race, and you really can't compete in a serious congressional campaign without that money. And it's not just money; it's the volunteers, it's the number of shifts you can pull, it's the leads and coordination that's required to move across, you know, often very large congressional districts geographically. It's an enormous lift, and of course, I think, you know, we're not going to win socialism, you know, state by state. There's no way it happens. But what we can do is, you know, build political parties, essentially build vehicles that are able to involve people, that have electeds which actively engage their districts, which articulate a public program and contend, are able to, you know, be in the news for what they're fighting for, you know, whatever it is, realign unions toward a progressive alternative. Those things are possible. And it seems to me like the resources that you get from doing that, you know, and the sort of scale that you can build by pursuing a strategy like that is what's necessary to be able to compete coherently at the national level, and also, you know, what's best suited for how DSA is structured. You know, there are groups like Justice Dems who can raise tons of money, you know, build a national profile, recruit volunteers. But what we have is on the ground organizers in 50 states who know their communities, who, you know, can be moved into action. And it seems to me like, so for us, just in terms of where we stand, you know, we should aim to be able to fight. We should aim to be able to fight where we can and win elections where we can. And I mean, you've heard Jenny and I talk about the Tax the Rich campaign. But one takeaway is just that this wouldn't exactly be possible if we didn't have socialist legislators in office. That some of the things that we're able to do, you know, we weren't able to do last year, but we're able to do now. And so in order to be able to run a campaign that's at the scale and effectiveness that we have now, you know, it requires this kind of thing. So. And then I think Jenny said it's specific to New York, but I'm fairly sure that across the country, municipalities have much more limited fiscal resources available to them, are much more constrained in how they can raise revenue than state legislatures. And so, and also the, you know, with the control over electoral law, you know, in particular, I think there's just like very strong reasons to contend at the state level and try to do that everywhere we can.
I completely agree. Just on the level of struggle, I think winning statewide and having sort of state power is I mean, ultimately we need national solutions, but I think the state gets us a lot closer to that and mirrors some of those conditions in a way that the municipal doesn't. That even leaving aside the question of like what municipalities can tax and which ones can't. So just on the level of sort of like building strength and trying to win in, you know, operate, both win races and support candidates and elected officials in broader and variegated kind of state level environments. And all those levels, it mirrors the national situation much more closely than city council type seats. That not to say it's useless, but that's where my own kind of strategic priorities would be.
I'll just add one thing that Matt pointed to that I think is very important. But I think also like one of the pieces of that is that contending at the state level allows you to build the kind of cadre that you need in order to be able to, you need people who can write policy. You need people who can communicate that effectively. You need people who, know how to move things in a legislature. I know those, and there are many reasons why we look down on many of those things as being a part of the corruption of the bourgeois state or whatever it may be. But at a basic level, like those things don't simply come, and you can't find them. There are not a ton of socialist Capitol Hill staffers just lying around. We have to develop those people, and so it's through doing work at the state level that I think we can do that most plausibly. Certainly, like in the Tax the Rich campaign, we've trained and in sort of staffing up our legislators. Like we've trained a much wider circle of people than we had a year ago who can do these kinds of things.
Paul, did you have any thoughts on this?
No, I mean, just to kind of back that up, and there's probably people here who are much better New Deal historians than I am, but as I understand it, some of the New Deal policies were first tested out and kind of pushed through at the state level, especially New York State. So I think that's kind of almost another way to look at it too. And again, I think we're in this moment of like, I think take Green New Deal, for example. I think, it's not like building trades workers wake up like, how can I destroy the environment today? It's more just like, sounds great, I need to see it. Like, show me a job. So like, and that speaks to like, we just need to have successful examples that are very practical to deliver first. And I think, it may be that, I'm not saying for everything, but it may be that a lot of that stuff is first kind of piloted at the state level. And again, that's kind of why I mentioned, I'm kind of interested about this guy, Marty Walsh, who's the labor secretary. And he was in the building trades, but he was actually leader of a pretty progressive section of the building trades. And I am interested if someone like him might be able to kind of warm up the building trades more to green, renewable projects and get them more bought in, since, he's one of them, so to speak. But yeah, that's just to say that, I think at a state level, I think is important for building up our competence and proving that we can do something as a left before maybe going to the national level.
Thank you. We should wrap up because it's almost 8:30 and we've had you all for an hour and a half. But I wanted to make a couple of plugs for our future campaigns and events that are coming up, and also to thank our speakers again for talking about this important issue as we're trying to navigate this newfound political terrain. So first, our very own Philly DSA Policy Committee is trying to research progressive taxation policies and how we could implement our own Tax the Rich campaign. And they need volunteers to kind of help with some of the research. So if you could reach out to Isaac, who's on the policy committee, his info is on the website, and he's also going to drop his information in the chat. Next Tuesday, we have Matt Klein coming to talk about his new book, which is called Trade Wars Are Class Wars, that he co-authored with Michael Pettis. And it talks all about how basically conflicts between countries are really resolutions of conflicts, class conflict within nations. And it's a really great book, and I hope you can come to talk about it. And then finally, our next general meeting is Sunday, March 21st from 12 to 3. And I hope that you all can make it if you're part of the chapter. So thank you again to our speakers. It was really exciting to hear all about the Tax the Rich campaign and to get Paul and Matt's ear. So thank you.
Thank you guys. Nothing, can I just say, as nothing brings Philly and New York together like taxing the rich, except maybe, just annihilating New England sports. Those are the only two things that can forge this unity bond, this unholy alliance here. Anyway, it was cool to listen into what you guys had to say, and I appreciate it.
Would love to keep talking.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Jenny.